seeing and watching video of my dad crying out for help and saying, I can't breathe over and over again, and no one responding to that and doing anything about it. And I had that same sense of not being able to breathe the other night. I woke up 3:30 in the morning as a parent thinking about my daughter who was on the road to Kansas. And I instantly grabbed my phone and sent out a message, "Are you okay?" And I reached out to my other, "Hey, where are you guys at? Are you guys okay?" And that hadn't been something that I had done for a while. It's been a while since I had those kind of concerns, but I have had those before. We've had the conversations like most African American families have with their kids about being careful and what to do when you're stopped by law enforcement. And it's not that all law enforcement is evil or bad, but in particular, there's no doubt about it that disproportionately African Americans have had contacts with law enforcement that have not been good, where they've been prejudged to be people just by their very presence that have been perceived as being a threat. And so that's a very real thing that we live with. And so that all those emotions came back, and it was I would say feelings of, when you talk about my feelings, there were feelings of fear. And you begin to think, man, I don't want my son or my daughter to be next, or one of my nephews, or just anyone that I knew. I thought about our youth minister here at College Hill Pres, and I thought, man, I don't want him to be next. And I thought, and I felt that if I didn't speak out, then I was somehow complicit in what I saw as a continuation of just abuses of power that have taken place, just not only with George, but also with Ahmaud and just so many others. And so it just seemed to all flood back in. And so for me, I knew it was really something that I could no longer just be silent and quiet about and just sort of wait for the wheels of justice to turn, because frankly, those wheels have turned, but they've not always turned in the right direction when it has come to Black and brown people and justice. And so, so deep emotions for sure.
And particularly as it related to you as a former police officer, how did that play into this also?
Yeah, it brought back a lot. When I think of that, for me, I think of privilege, because I have a certain level of privilege, and I think of white privilege, because I think that's that's something that we live with in our country. There's no doubt about it. No one's going to turn in their privilege card, and I have a certain amount of privilege as being a retired police officer. When I get stopped as a Black man by law enforcement, I don't have to worry about the same things that perhaps my brothers would of color. I open my wallet and instantly there's a badge and my driver's license is there, and all of a sudden it sets things at a certain level of calm. But as a police officer, that makes me know that I live in a privileged place. But I would think it would be remiss of me not to think about the privilege that I have and to not use that as an excuse to be silent for those who don't have privilege. And so that's something I would say also for white Americans and white believers, in fact, just to recognize that you have a privilege. You don't need to feel guilty about that privilege, but you do have a responsibility to sort of consider where your brothers are who don't have the privilege. And so, I typically took a stance in a lot of incidents prior to this one, really against my friends and sometimes family members. I've stood on the side of law enforcement when there were questionable situations. Well, this was definitely not that. And I know how it is working a night shift when you come across a vehicle and how critical it is to make sure that you're protecting yourself. And so sometimes ordinary citizens don't know what it means and why there are so many police cars that show up and why officers sometimes speak in an aggressive manner. All those things, I'm okay with all that. And I think that's normal. That's natural, because you want to go home at night too. But when you look at what occurred in this situation, there's just absolutely no excuse for that. You have other officers there who are telling you, hey, to stop, or reaching up and checking for his pulse and saying, maybe we should turn him over. And to do nothing really is just total, it's what I call, when I post on Facebook, just a true lynching. And I say that with no sense of holding back, knowing that even still as a former police officer, I wholeheartedly support the blue, but I also support the Black. I can't deny who I am as a Black man. And so by no means do I downplay that. in any way. And I have a highest regard and respect for law enforcement, nor do I think that's indicative of all or even most of law enforcement. But I think we have to admit that we do have still a problem in our nation as a whole around how law enforcement interacts with African Americans. When you look at the disproportionate amount of African Americans that are placed in the penal system as a whole, jailed and put in prison, and I mean the disproportion of African Americans that are on death row, even, I mean that's just not something that just happens just because there is what I call a systematic system of just a racist thought that comes out and actions of law enforcement. And I think sometimes it's not, I tell people sometimes this, racism is not always racism, in the sense that people can act out and do racist things without even recognizing that they're coming from a racist position. And then we call those culpable mental states in law enforcement. So whether it's recklessly, knowingly, or negligently, the result can still be the same. And so I would say in this case with George, there's no doubt about it. I would say that he knowingly caused the death of another. But whether it was reckless or not, or whether he was careless or negligent, I think the effect is still the same. And I think we bear that brunt as African Americans. And unfortunately, we have to live with that disparity to a certain degree here in this country, where the perception is just a perception. But I'm hopeful when I see what I see in terms of those who are protesting, who don't always look the same, who hadn't looked the same when I look across this nation. It's wonderful to see people of a variety of different colors and age stand up and say that enough is enough, and this is just not called for.
No, thanks. One thing I really appreciate, all that you shared, but one thing early on that hit me was just that notion of that terror that you had, because the difference between me and you, because of our skin color, is I could watch that absolutely horrific thing, and I would not naturally put my children or my father or anybody that's white in that position, and that keeps me emotionally separated. I'm a little bit of a emotional neophyte anyway, so I need all the help I can get, and that's why, for if nothing more, these gatherings where we really share with one another, how are you feeling, help me to empathize, to feel even more, and of just the horror, and just how sickening it was, just simply, to watch that. If you just sit and watch that 8-9 minutes, it seems like it's 9 hours as you see the life slowly being drained from another human being, and just hearing you continue to share those stories helps me stay in that emotion, to really feel that evil, I think the other thing for me, just in terms of how I've felt in this, is the continued need for relationships of substance with folks of different color, skin than me, to really understand and hear that, and to recognize, ultimately, as you just said, my privilege, and my advantage, my position as a white man, and that fear of the police isn't something that we talk about in our with my kids. It wasn't. It was, no, they're trusted and good, so do what they say, and that was the essence of that kind of talk, and telling them where to put their hands and all that kind of stuff just did not really enter even into our interaction. So it helped me to recognize that even though we are in the same city or in the same nation, it's a very different city in a very different nation, depending on the color of our skin. So I appreciate you sharing that too.
And I would say that empathy, as you said, it has to be intentional. I don't think it's natural always to empathize in general. I think it's a part of the fall that we know as Christ followers. I mean, it's something you have to put to death, is this lack of empathy and care for one another. And I think it goes across all races. I mean, I think to be thoughtful of another, we have to be mindful of that. And I think it's always going to be that way. And even when I think about things like, how you're stopped by the police, I know that a lot of my friends and relatives have that talk. We call it the talk. We have it oftentimes out of fear, just, hey, you're worried and you're concerned. And I didn't have it so much out of fear from a policing background. I just knew that it was the safest thing to do. And I didn't teach my children, okay, do this, because if you don't, they're just going to kill you. But I knew that it calmed the situation down when if you're driving at night, if you have any amount of tint in your windows or multiple people in the car. I know for me, the first thing I was doing as I approached was telling people to let me see their hands. And so I told my kids, roll down the window, turn on your lights, put your hands on the steering wheel and keep them there. Don't make erratic movements towards the glove compartment. Because let's face it, I mean, as sad as it is to say, some of the things we learn in training from law enforcement says that those can become some of the excuses you use when you find yourself in a deadly force encounter. Well, that person made an erratic movement towards their glove compartment. I thought they were reaching for a weapon. So, and we've seen those excuses used time and time again in the sense of trying to prosecute someone in law enforcement for something that they did that might have been even a mistake, but they hide behind some of the loopholes. And so I taught my kids early on just to, make sure that officer knows that when he approaches a car, he didn't have to fear for his safety, because I've been on the other side of that and I know what it's like to want to go home, kiss my children goodnight as well. So it's a very real deal to do that. And when you talk about empathy and privilege, I lived in another country for a number of years, about 5 years. And so it's sort of a missiological idea that when you are the minority and you're in and among a majority culture, no matter what that culture is, you're going to have to be mindful of how that culture operates in order so that you can do well within that culture. And of course, we don't affirm cultural assimilation or racial assimilation. I think that's a poor idea. And I think oftentimes churches take that position. We want African Americans in our churches, but as long as they are assimilating culturally or racially into our identity as a predominant culture, if it's white culture, and the other way around, if it's Black culture, then that's acceptable. And we know that just from a missiological standpoint, from myself being in missions, that, that privilege that I had at times being an American, I didn't say, well, boy, I don't want that privilege. If I went through and they're like, oh, you're an American, you can go ahead, you go through. Sure, thank you. I'll go ahead and go ahead. And I didn't refuse that. And so I don't think it's necessarily comes down to where you have to necessarily deny your privilege. I think you need to own it, though. You need to own the fact and face the reality that you don't live with the same thing that another culture will, and it causes that kind of empathy, and it causes love to take place in ways that it really wouldn't otherwise. So,
yeah, that's a good example that sort of separated from the emotion and the complexity of this particular case, and also just being in the midst of it as Black and white Americans, to look at it from a third party. Being an American in Jamaica, you can see the distinction there, and how one has privilege simply because of the country you were born in when you're there, and to recognize that for me, that simply because the color of my skin gives me an advantage, and like you've said, there's in all kinds of ways, from the accumulation of wealth over the years, where as we look at history, you look back at the things like the GI Bill and those kind of things, where they were readily available for folks that came back from the war, but not readily available to blacks as whites. And then in those days as well, you didn't have freedom as African American coming back from World War II to just buy the house wherever you wanted, if you even did have those resources. And and that's just one example of many that set up a system of advantage for me because of the color of my skin that I was born in. But I think it's one that has to be realized. And then the term I like to use is steward that well. Recognize that's there and steward that well. But then the journey is to pursue what is just, which is to not so much tear down, but to build up to. And what we're looking for is justice and equality for all. And that's our long-term pursuit together. And that's a question for us maybe later today or at another time.
Yeah, I like that word stewardship. I look back to my times in law enforcement going to court, and I remember seeing you would see a white defendant and a black defendant, similar crimes committed, similar situations, except for how they understood how to work the system. And we would sit there in the jury box just waiting for our cases coming up. And we among ourselves, we would say, well, he's going to get, and as cruel as it sounds, he's going to get black time. Black time is different than white time. So what we meant was, just because simply he didn't know how to work the system, he doesn't know how to pretend and say the right things to make the judge feel better about how he operated, then that time will be significantly less. That will significantly more for him being African American than it would be for a white person that did the same crime. And I found myself being very judgmental when I was still in the blue, sometimes thinking, well, he should have known better. Had he known better and had he done better, then he wouldn't find himself in this situation. And I didn't take into account all of the systems that play into how a person is formed and shaped. And if you take into account the systematic nature of racism in this country that's been here and that we see rearing its head even now, then you can understand and better understand how a person can find themselves in a situation where you would say, man, why would he even do this crime? He knows that he's going to get black time, which is going to be more time. And if you know that, then why don't you stop doing these things? And when you begin to realize the bigger picture, it surely makes a bigger difference in how I know when you're doing that job, how you go about doing that job in law enforcement.
That's another great, just simple example. The difference, you're going to do black time or white time. Again, a systemic issue that demonstrates in another arena inequality. One more just example. Personally, we lived in Mobile, Alabama before coming here, and we had the original deed on the property of our house. Really neat document, and it was in 1910 is when that house was built. And on the deed, you couldn't have. There were like 5 stipulations. I remember the first 3. The first one was you had to be you had to be 20 feet from the street. The second one was you had to that the property had to be valued at more than $5,000 that you were going to build on it. I remember the third thing. Your fence could not be taller than 3 feet, and then the fourth was you couldn't have a drop of African blood and own the house. And that was in 1910 that deed was built. And of course, that's just another example of that privilege that my family would have had just a couple generations ago to be able to buy a house in that particular area. And that continues on even into recent times, what we called redlining, where banks wouldn't give loans to people, to African Americans in certain neighborhoods, or they would charge them exorbitant fees to be able to do that. And again, that's a system that's at work that is causing such different abilities and opportunities. It truly wasn't just an equal opportunity then, and the impact of that over the years of accumulating wealth, we continue to see that today. All right. Well, I wanted to jump to another question, but what have you felt and experienced from God during this time, Darryll? What spiritually have you maneuvered through this? What have you heard and felt?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, it changed my feelings. What I felt from God initially, I felt I almost really related to was it Habakkuk, the guy who lamented to God, how long, and I approached God just in my own truth, at home when I began to see this, and again, it brought back emotions, and so I cried out to God just in that truth of God, how long will justice be denied and delayed? How long will we be stuck in a system that we work for it, but it doesn't work for us? How long, God, will the blood of Black and brown individuals be spewed out on our streets and washed away with a sense of indifference by law enforcement that's supposed to protect us? How long do we pay our taxes for a very system that works against us in law? So I cried out a lot with a lot of the how long is this going to be this way before, especially when you think that we've made some mileage and made some difference. And I thought that because I live in an environment, I get to worship in an environment as many of you do, like at College Hill Presbyterian, most of my connections and relationships are great around the lines of race and ethnicity. And so it's easy to feel as if though you've made much further leap than you really have. And so I initially approached God from just a position of lament. And then from that, I began to I felt like I got permission from God to sound off, to go ahead and express my heart fully, knowing that those who really truly loved me and cared for me as an individual could wade through the pain and feelings that I had initially. So I began to speak out through social media, and I had no idea how Facebook worked, still don't very well, but I began to just say, things like, hey, this is not time for the protest to stop, it's time for the protest to ramp up. And things like, hey, I'm calling for non-peaceful protests, which is not talking about violence or looting, but talking about letting our voices be heard, as Pastor Chris Beard said in the city. It's time for us to raise our voices and not be passive and quiet. So I began to do that. And then I began to I heard from God more of an affirmation. I didn't have to play it safe as a Christian. And oftentimes that's been the position that I've taken. I still need to play it fair and play it in love and all that. But I didn't have to be so cautious and careful for fear to offend. I could speak really the truth, because the truth is really what sets people free. And it took me back to a minister friend of mine. His name was Kim Terry, one of the greatest guys that really mentored me young. He told me, never tell the truth. The truth is dangerous. And he said, I remember like, hey, what do you mean? Like we're people of truth. There's no, Darryll, telling the truth is dangerous. Never do that. Always tell the truth in love. And so from that, I was released in my own heart to face the truth about the disenfranchisement that people experience. When I have a person here that even goes to our church that says, man, I'm tired of people asking me where I'm from just because of the color of my skin, the hue that's a little bit different. And our colors, it's there to describe us, not to define us. We know that, but too often we're defined by that. So God allowed me to go through that process of telling the truth in love. And then I would say probably the most amazing thing to me was probably that I saw God speaking, because I think God speaks through his people more than anything else, was on our sort of prayer, protests, quiet walk that we had here in the community, where we thought 50 people would show up, and there were over 200 and something, and people were joining in. That really spoke volumes, just to know that my community of faith understood and cared. And I think oftentimes white people, particularly, like, what can we do? How can we show? And what do we need to say? And sometimes it's really not in what you say, it's in what you do. And your presence speaks more oftentimes than your words do. So for me, I saw God when I saw Jennifer Cronk from our church talking and reaching out to people and finding out how they were doing. Man, to me, that was God. When I saw us walking together down the path and I saw people driving by honking, when I saw Black Lives Matters signs up and we stand in justice for George Floyd, those things like that made me realize that I could truly be who I am. And I can tell you, oftentimes in church, it's even harder for people because we have this melting pot mentality. We read First Peter and we say, well, we're supposed to be one holy race. And I have issue with that because if we're supposed to be one holy race, oftentimes what that means is I need to assimilate into the dominant race. And really, I think that we're really more called to be a mosaic, an example of what God says it will be like in heaven, which means that I don't necessarily have to toss my race aside. And so for me, it was healthy just to be able to see the embrace and to hear people say, hey, how are you doing? How are you really doing? And hey, we're praying, we're right there with you. Not necessarily mean that we're on the same page about some of the things that I might have said. I mean, I had people who told me, hey, Darryll, I don't particularly like what you said about POTUS and his position. But at the same time, we still love you. And I've never really agreed with any president for the past 10,000 years because I don't think everybody, I have a lot to say about politics. But in my spirit, I still felt that, man, our president needs to be more presidential. I was looking for him to stand up and stand out and be a voice of reason. And while I still think that's a good position, I think ultimately that if we only look in that direction, we're looking at the wrong place. And so God just began to work in me through that and letting me know through the people that are right here in this community, people like David Ray and Bill McCord, people who I've known for years who reach out and said, hey, man, we're standing with you. Knowing that I love the police agencies and how what they're supposed to stand for, and at the same time, I hate injustice. So that I know I said a lot, but that's what it's.
It's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think one of the things for me was that you felt that freedom to be able to speak out, because often in our positions as leadership in the church, we can be very guarded by what we say, not wanting to tick people off, make them because that great terror of all, maybe they'll leave the church over it.
Yeah.
And what I appreciated was your freedom to be who you are, because that is what we long to move to be, a place where we can be honest and real with one another in our setting and in our relationships. And that's and on this journey in the last 13 years, that has not always been the case. That kind of freedom was either felt or experienced or lived out. One of the things for me, particularly about experiencing God in that, was on Tuesday we had our staff meeting, and opened the staff meeting basically with the same question. Okay, how are you feeling? And Darryll and Samuel, who's the student ministry director that he spoke of, he's also African American, in his mid-20s, were able to share, how they were really feeling, and the conflict in their soul, that they were on a emotional roller coaster. I think both of you said, Darryll, you just don't know where's the emotion going to be in the next hour, or how am I going to be feeling when I wake up? And that there was beauty in being able to share that, but again, feeling that pain and just staying there. And for me, that's one of the words of the Lord in this, is to that one of the challenges of empathy is it's just not comfortable. And I have the freedom to isolate or avoid. I can go into my world, and as a white man, and simply not be impacted by what's going on, and just hearing the the Lord say, no, you need to stay. You need to feel that pain with them. You need to empathize with that. And that was a powerful experience. And I even wrote in my journal today, and that wasn't one of the things I was expecting as a pastor of a church that is intentionally pursuing being multiracial. I knew there'd be hard things. I knew politics would be involved. I knew there'd be issues of understanding our history and owning it, but I just didn't expect. And once or twice this week, I mean, I tear up over all kinds of things. I tear up at commercials these days. I don't know what it is. Whenever I see it, just something that looks like compassion, looks like forgiveness, I'll tear up. But I'm not that weepy. But I've wept twice this week because of the gift of you and Samuel also just sharing of your experience. And that I hearken back to that what a gift that is, because I think that maybe that's some of what Jesus was saying when he said, blessed are those that weep, because the gift you've been given is being able to see beyond yourself and the pain and the reality and the brokenness of the world around you. And that's a real gift. And to believe and trust in him that those that weep are comforted in him as well. Yeah.
I would say that that even that's unusual. I mean, it's unusual to be in a place where you're safe to be who you fully are. I mean, it really is unusual, not just from a staff standpoint, but even from a church community standpoint. Yeah. I think when it comes to being multi-ethnic or even multi-generational, the tendency is to think, for us as African Americans, okay, we know they will be okay with Black culture. Like we know that, a little good Black music is that's acceptable. That's good. They'll be okay with Black presence showing up, as long, but the question is, if Black people are you okay with Black anger? Are you okay when Black people are justifiably and rightfully, are they allowed to express themselves from that depth and not be seen as just emotional, or just because this is, as much as this was a painful experience and the emotions ran the gamut, the tendency for me was not to want to share emotion, because I thought if you do that, then this will turn into, well, these are just emotional people who are just going through something, and this will all pass. It will not be taken seriously. But when you have a safe environment where you know that it's coming from a place of truth and authenticity, then I think then you can truly be vulnerable enough to share your emotions and not to be having this thinking that someone is going to assume that that's all you are, which frankly, that's been sort of a reality sometimes when you try to come together along the lines of ethnicity. And so I appreciate that, and I applaud your leadership just in having us arrive at the place in our journey that we are now as a church.
Now, thanks for sharing that. Again, that's a great illustration of how easily it is to deny who somebody is because of their emotion or their reaction or because their experience. And I'm sure one of the things that I hear from folks a lot is, they get tired of sharing their story. And, one of the things, and again, I appreciate even you doing this and really sharing with us, and that it's not just to hear, but then also to be changed ourselves and to engage, in honest interaction, so, and I think that's in some ways you're modeling well for a lot of white people, because I think what I hear a lot of white people is they're scared to get engaged, because once they do, they fear being called a racist. Yeah. And so if they don't engage, then at least that doesn't happen. And again, I think that's a position of privilege. We can do that and sort of keep back and not engage in the conversation. And so one of my challenges to folks on here is to engage. Everybody's you're muted, and that's by me. So you're being good and abiding by that right now. But in time to not be, what are those doubts, those wonders, those questions to explore and learn and grow. And we'll give some other resources, and when we end, some other opportunities to move forward. But given that for the most part we live in a segregated society still, and the church has been even one of the slowest institutions to, if nothing more, at least to move into integration, to just be in the same room, let alone have a conversation like this. And I think that's why that so many people would turn onto this, because it's so rare that we've been able to have these kind of open and honest conversations. And what is sad, and I'm guilty as this is the rest, is that it takes a heinous death in Minneapolis and in Louisville and in Georgia in the course of a couple weeks to those things be brought up to say, oh yeah, we need to be doing this. That's sad that it takes that to really push us there, and it's sad that that's where we are. That we as a church are 177 years old. We as a nation, over 200 years old, and yet we're still so segregated so that we don't really even know one another. We know more about one another from the movies we see or the TV we watch or the news than we do from really sharing life with each other. And that, I can confess on behalf of the church, is a sin that we're paying for today, because the church isn't really today in a position of leadership. I was in a meeting with some other pastors the other day, and one of the pastors, a well-known African-American pastor in the city, just said, so what do the white evangelicals have to bring to this conversation? Are they worth anything in this conversation? I just stammered and didn't know, what to say in the moment, because from his perspective, he would say they really don't bring anything. And and eventually said to him, well, I think what we do have is a love and a belief and a trust in the Bible. And the Bible's on the side of justice. The Bible's on the side of equality for all. So if we continue to truly pursue the biblical call of God, then we'll move down this direction. But that's what it takes. But along those lines, how do you interact with folks? How do you handle disagreements that you have with other Christians when you get to points of disagreeing around? I mean, I think everybody would say, yeah, you're right, George Floyd, that instance, that is horrible. And yet some would say, yeah, that's an individual instance, that bad cop, that's a bad guy. It's one thing there. And but the whole notion of other things that are a part of it, they may start to disagree with that or with other things. How do you handle those kind of situations?
Yeah, for me, I tend to approach it in the context that agreement is not the goal. So I think oftentimes we get in trouble when we try to push for agreement, because then we're trying to convince someone of our particular point of view or our truth. And so I go back to things that aren't really clearly spelled out biblically, that aren't just, sort of black letter, red letter things. Then those things really, my idea of truth in the area may not be the same as yours. And we don't have to convince each other to agree on that. I think we push to love instead of pushing to agreement. And I think if we do that, then we will always land in the right place and push to relationship. Because I think no matter what we agree or disagree about, we can still always walk in love, and we can still pretty much always have relationship. And so that's the position I tend to take, and I think it's just so important. And one of the things we do, that's what we seek for. I think we have to also, along with that, work towards acknowledging not just pain, but acknowledging that person's reality for them. It doesn't have to be our reality for it to be a reality. And we don't always have to totally understand it to say, hey, I understand how you feel. That's just how you feel. I don't feel that way, but hey, I understand how you feel. Let's talk about this, or let's do this. And I think sometimes we have to just shift to something that we do agree about, and then come back again and try to discuss again. I think that's not necessarily meaning that we somehow water down our convictions, but I think ultimately the thing that we can really stand solidly on is really should be rooted and grounded in love and Christ. And so I think that's just the ultimate for us to pursue, especially in disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been neat for me just hearing, I've gotten direct communication back from people who said, hey, what do you mean by that when you say that? And I don't really agree with that. And then after a while, we kind of communicated a little bit, and I was like, yeah, you know what, I agree. And then I would say, yeah, I agree with you on that too. And we really weren't seeking for agreement, but we knew that our common ground was just love for one another. And that's really all that matters. And we heard one another. So I think that's just key.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good word, to not necessarily always be pushing for agreement, but to really understand and hear one another. That's and to move into love. That I find that on some social media, I don't live into that very well. It's just really easy in that medium to really. I probably went on it was a ping pong match on our little reply back and forth and on Facebook the other day with an individual I know from home, and look back on that and say, yeah, probably part of the problem is that we're really trying to push one another to agree with each other, and then we stop listening at some point. So that's really helpful. Good thought. We've got we're coming up on 8:00, and so if anybody has other questions you want to throw into the chat room, go ahead and do that now, and we'll see if we can work those in if you do. But one of the other questions that I think folks asked ahead of time was, well, what can we do? What can I do? How? And you shared some of that during this already. But how would you, if you had to summarize that, what would you say to folks?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is just to, when it comes to doing or saying, I think we can acknowledge another person's pain, and I think we acknowledge it as real and not just the ghost pain of something from a long time ago. I think when it comes to issues of race, it's easy to say, well, I hear your pain and associate it with, slavery, for instance. That's a very real thing. But no, my pain is real. It's not a ghost pain. And that you acknowledge that, even if you don't fully get it, fully understand it, then I think that just goes a long way. And I tend to think about one of Jesus' great stories about the Good Samaritan, and just how in that passage, he came to where the guy was. The Samaritan did. And then he went beyond that. He saw him, is what it says in scripture. And I think for us to come to where another person is, to put ourselves in their shoes, even if it's on our own mind, our heart, to pull away from Facebook or whatever the conversation is and put ourselves in that person's shoes, come to where they are and to identify them, to see them as they really are, and to identify with them. And then he went on to have compassion on him, which means there's a response. And that response can simply be just caring or loving or supporting, or it can be saying, hey, I don't really have a lot to say, but man, I can sure stand with you if you want to walk downtown and just support you while you let your voice be heard. I think compassion can take on a lot of different forms. It can take on just simple kindness and just showing empathy. I saw kindness and compassion just on so many of my brothers and sisters, just by simply those who are on Facebook who said, man, I like that there. That's right on. Who said, man, and you're right, on Christ, a solid rock, that's all we can stand on. They may not have liked anything else, but I saw compassion when they showed up there. So I think it's just a matter of acknowledging. And I think whether it's this issue or another issue, there will always be issues of pain in each other's lives that we'll have to come to grips with and recognize that the best thing we can do is to show compassion and love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. Got one question. A couple other questions. One, how have you found it worked to create an environment for you to be real? As you think about that, what were some of the things that allowed for that to happen that maybe hadn't happened in your past, or had happened in your past, and there you found common elements there? How do you create an environment to allow people to be real?
Yeah, I don't know how I can't say that I really know how you create an environment where that happens. I think this is a tipping point situation. I think we've come to a head in culture. When you look around the world and see what we're facing right now, I think this moment speaks like no other moment has. And it speaks more than just to George Floyd. It speaks to how we live our lives out. So I think how you create an environment, if I were to try to create it, is just on truth. And not necessarily opinion, but just the truth of God's word that we know is real, which tells us to love God with all our hearts, our soul, our mind, our strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves. And so for me, what made the difference here was just testing that, because you can't see it. I mean, I didn't know for sure what would come out of my sharing from the depths of my heart. And frankly, I have been in other places where people were okay with the good music that I was able to produce, or the good inspirational message. They like the fact that we have 50 people of color that are going to join in, but when we shared who we were, then that was an offense. And so I think you don't know sometimes, and I think we have an obligation though. The thing that I'm challenged with more and more is that do or die situation, and I felt it here because I felt that this was a real pivotal point for change, that it didn't matter anymore to me because I felt compelled in this moment. And so frankly, I knew that, man, I'm starting a new role, shifting from part-time to full-time on June 1st here at College Hill Presbyterian Church. I mean, this just keeping it real. I thought, man, you know what? Drew may call me in the office on Monday and say, Darryll, you may go a little bit too far. Those thoughts came because just as God speaks, we have a real enemy that speaks. And I thought, man, I wonder, I preach once a month. Is anyone going to show up on Sunday because they're going to or is
that why you lock your office door on that Monday? I wonder.
That's why I got real serious when you knocked and came in like, oh boy. But I think relationship just makes all the difference. And I think we have to, in any loving relationship, there comes a point, especially when it's new, where if you don't, in the beginning, in the early phases of your relationship, ever have an encounter where you're speaking truth, and in particular speaking out of your pain, then another person will never know how you will react in a painful situation like that. So I don't think you would have known what kind of person I would be and how I would respond and how I would react were it not for a situation like this, maybe until years down the line, until something else came up again. And so again, I had no idea, but I knew that this was so critical. I knew for me, I had a responsibility, not just to my children, but to the other African Americans that they're looking for me to step up and be the leader that they needed to see. When it's a multi-ethnic, multiracial church, there's no doubt about it. One of the key points is having a leader that's up front, that's visible, that people can identify with. And it was the same when I was in Jamaica and in the all Black churches. People who were missionaries, they were happy when there was a white face coming in and speaking and sharing. So that was a pivotal thing. But they needed to see that kind of leader in our context speak truth and identify with their pain and their struggle, and not just play it safe and be casual. It'll all work out. Well, no, maybe it won't work out unless we get out there, raise our voices, vote, and rally around what we believe truth. And so it's a both and, I would say.
Sorry, you guys are asking some really good questions, but I'm just I'm paying attention to Darryll and listening. Not doing a good job of capturing these. Next question: if you're still actively working for the police department, what steps would you take to seek justice for African Americans within your department? And I'll add, just within the city.
Yeah, first of all, I'm 100% biased towards Cincinnati Police Department. I'll just tell you that right off the bat. I spent 16 years of my life there. I was there, during the collaboration agreement time period, and I saw the resistance to that. So I was there. I was one of the ones that didn't like some of the outcomes and a lot more paperwork, and I didn't like some of the things that were coming out. There were responsibilities that we needed to step up and do. It was telling that we, in fact, it came out that we clearly were a bias-based policing system, that was really going on in Cincinnati. But I was proud of the other side. I would say the other side of that, and we still got a lot of work to do. But I'm also proud of just what I see in Cincinnati when I see Chief Isaacs and others like Andre Ewing taking a knee in solidarity and saying, no, we don't stand for that. So that brings me a great deal of pride. So if I were there now, I would be out there. I wouldn't be out there alone in the crowd by myself, but I would be out there among my brother officers, and I would be letting them know, the people know, and not just the officers, hey man, we're with you, we support you. It was quite moving for me when I saw one of the lieutenants in the National Guard, I think it was in Washington, and his crew, the troops, take a knee with some of the people. They were standing there just talking with them about what was going on and what they felt. And that lieutenant took the bold move to take a knee. And so for me, I served in the military. I'm a true, proud patriot. I'm one of those kind of people who, man, when it's time to fly a flag, I want to fly a big one. I mean, that's just where I am, truly. I have no issues about my national anthem. I had relatives that served in our armed forces, my nephew, Nate Davis. So I have a proud heritage when it comes around military service, and having served in other countries and been around the world, man, I value what we have here. And I know we have a system. It's not a perfect system. It needs to be overhauled, especially in other places. But I'm grateful for the work that's taking place here in our city. And I think there's no real conflict in supporting our country, supporting our police department, and still saying, hey, as a whole, we've got some work to do because the system is still broken and there's still a lot more oppression that there needs to be towards people of color. And I would say that's a very real truth. And I know what it's like myself to have worked in the police department. I'll just say this real quick. I know how easy it is, even being an African American, to be biased towards African Americans. I didn't see that being a part of who I was until later on in my career. I was busy and anxious and passionate about making arrests and cleaning up the bad guys, if you will, in the African American community. And I was zealous about it. And so in doing that, though, day in and day after, you hear on the radio, male black, 18 to 25 over the radio, male black, 18 to 25. Most of my negative contacts, male black, 18 to 25. And the common uniform, long white t-shirt and dark colored jeans that are hanging. So that began to be impregnated into my mind. And so after a while, I stopped a car and there were male blacks 18 to 25. I was a lot more cautious than I was if I stopped that same car with 18 to 25 male whites. And those guys might have had dead bodies in the trunk, Uzis waiting for me in the back seat. But I let that sense of complacency, because of my experience policing in only one type of community, sort of created me a mentality that's biased, that's totally wrong, and that causes problems. And so I would say if I were the chief of police, or if I was serving today, I would make sure that officers aren't just limited to quote unquote African American communities, and that's just, and the good thing is, it's hard to find quote unquote just an African American community, but we do have cities that are highly more populated. I mean, not cities, but communities that are highly more populated, apartment housing complexes, and I think those officers need to rotate out of there, because if you don't, then after a while you just get conditioned. If you see one thing all the time, then you begin to assume that all African Americans. And so I had to come home and look at my own picture, look at my own son, and then I realized, man, I have to make a change. So anyway, that's my long answer.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks. And I mean, we were talking the other day, you were sharing that. And as I thought about that, it really demonstrates for all of us is the power of being formed by sociological forces around us that we don't even realize. that we would never agree to in a cogent moment, but we're formed by the world around us so strongly and powerfully. And in that case, it's to say, oh, African American men are dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes something that is fearful for us, and that is our, like you're saying, our biases that can be formed by the world around us, implicit biases, where we feel our heart, speed up a little bit if there's a black man coming down the street the same size with us, or if we're in an elevator and there's just two of us, and the other, those forces are what are so insidious in us all, that can be formed, that cause that kind of division and that racist prejudice. So thanks for sharing that. On this is really a challenging question from Victoria, but I think I appreciate you, Victoria, being able to share. She says, how do you balance being a black person in this country and being a good Christian in this day and time when it seems that we've been forgotten by God? It seems that we're a creation that only knows pain and oppression. And even the power of that question, I just appreciate the power of asking that question.
Yeah, I truly appreciate the authenticity in that too. And I think that the challenge is to not balance it. I think the challenge is not to look at, I'm a black person or a Christian, how do I balance the two? No, you don't. You mesh the two, because the two are inseparable. Who we are as Christ followers, as people who shape our lives after Christ, it informs who we are as a race and as a culture. So there are cultural norms that might be a part of African American culture that may have nothing to do with what it means to be a Christ follower. And so those things just, they need to fall away. I don't cling to that's not righteous for the sake of my cultural identity. And so, and nor do I toss out my cultural norms and my heritage and my history and my personhood from my identity apart from Christianity, because it's not inherently evil or wrong. So I think they both have to coexist together. I don't know if I answer that question, but I certainly see that we do. I think we'll always live in a world where there's pain and sorrow and oppression in some form or another. And I truly think after 4 or 5 days of feeling a little bit in the opposite, I truly feel and think that, man, the church has to, this is a moment, an opportunity, I think, for the church to really rise up, to seize this opportunity, to demonstrate, those of us who have relationships, who have friends, we need to demonstrate what the world really should look like. And that also means calling out evil when we see it, and not just having kumbaya moments where we hold hands and sing happy songs. It means standing up and saying, no, enough is enough. I won't stand for you hurting someone that doesn't look like me, or treating them, or having this perception about them. So that's I think that's what it means to be a Christ follower, in fact.
Thanks. I know we're a little over time, so I want to wrap up. And Darryll, if you got any last words, you can be thinking about those. I'll give you the last word in a moment. I want to, again, thank you all for participating. And I want to jump off the last question. And I think also, it's interesting to another question was, do you think, and Darryll even mentioned to this, do you think it's a tipping point? Are there things happening that are really positive in this also? And to have one question saying, are things moving positive? And the other, how do you deal with just the consistent pain and oppression that one questioner felt? That to bring up the distinct differences and to hear them and to live into those is a positive step. But I think for people in positions of influence, people, whether it's whatever that influence might be, particularly for the majority culture, we need to do the same thing that Darryll just said, and identify what are the things we cling to that really are our culture, that but have nothing to do with Jesus? And what are the ways of Jesus that we who did not consider equality with God as something to be held on to, but instead he entered into the mess of the world in order to participate and for him to accomplish what is good, and what is just, and in the greatest act of love. The same is true for us together in relationships to pursue what is just. What we talked a lot about today was really just sharing feelings. How are we engaging with this? And what are you thinking about this? And recognizing the pain and the evil that's around us and that we're a part of. And that some of us benefit from and others are the oppressed. And we know that is not the way of God. And so we learn that and understand it. And then we ask and pursue, what do we do to bring about justice? And the thing that I've been reminded of, particularly for my white brothers and sisters, is to pray, reflect, and then act, primarily following our African American brothers and sisters. That it's really easy. It's a white thing to jump in and want to fix it, and to think we have the answer, and that and again, I'm all for taking steps of action, but for those of us that have been in the majority position, we really need to stop and prayerfully listen and reflect upon these things. Do a little bit of homework to explore what really is going on, and to really follow the folks in positions of leadership who don't look like us. And that's that group that I was talking about with a group of pastors, that I'm with, their notion is to say, there's black and white pastors, and they're like, we're the black pastors, we're going to lead, and we want you as white pastors to follow. And that's what we want to see happen. And so I think that could be the same for all of us. And I know that might be hard, and it's certainly not a call to inactivity, but an order that we need to really listen and consider and think, because this is stuff that's deep. We didn't get here yesterday, and we're not going to get out tomorrow, but it's not one that we are about gradual change. So I want to be sure that we keep our eyes open and stay involved in these issues. And again, this not be a blip for us. All right, two quick things, and then I'll let Darryll finish up. One, want to let you know, if you haven't heard, a great movie called Just Mercy is out, Justmercy, and it's the story of Brian Stevenson. Catches some of the stories based on the book by the same name, and it's now free if you have the capacity to stream on Amazon or a number of other platforms. You can watch it for free. And so we're going to be promoting in a week or two. We'll get out the details later, but just to encourage folks to watch that, and then we'll discuss. Brian Stevenson works with death row inmates and has given his life to them for decades, and a whole bunch of other things. Equal Justice Initiative. You can look that up. You can just Google him or Google Just Mercy to look up more about that. But that's available for June, and we're going to encourage folks to watch that and then come together and discuss it together. And the other item I encourage you to consider participating in to really listen and learn. It's the Racial Equity Matters training, and it's by Groundwater Presentation, and their basic illustration about groundwater is you walk by a lake, you see a dead fish, and you're like, that's too bad. Something must have happened to that fish, poor fish. You go by the lake a day or two later, and there's 20 dead fish. And you're like, there's something wrong with the water. And the notion of groundwater in that presentation is to say, what's wrong with the water? So that is on August 12th, 20 of this year, from 1 to 4:30. I'll write in the chat as Darryll is finishing up, and then the web address to check that out, so you can sign. It's virtual, so you can sign up to participate in that. But that's the Racial Equity Matters training. Okay.
All right, that's great. I don't have a lot to close out with, other than just to encourage us all just to continue in the journey of faith and prayer and hope. I don't think this is the end by any means of race relations in this country. I think the people, we the people, are better than what we've seen in recent days in our law enforcement, and people like the lady in the park with the guy who was doing his bird watching. I think we are much better than that as a people, and I think those that are for us all are greater and more than those that are against us all. And so I would encourage us to continue to walk in unity, to walk in love, and know that unity doesn't mean that we are all one race in the sense that we don't have our separate identities. I think we still have to recognize that as a church, just like a musical chord, a harmony is not made up of one note that's the same note over and over again, but it's different notes that don't all look the same, that make a totally distinct sound, but all together it's beautiful because we recognize that we've all been called to be a part of the whole. And so just lean into that and celebrate our differences. Don't just tolerate one another, but to actually celebrate one another and our differences. I was a church planter, and I intentionally planted a church where we had a common culture, and that made it easy for us to celebrate faith together. And I celebrated that, man. We have a common culture, but all that meant is that we did life exactly the same. How we thought about economics was exactly the same. All of us live pretty much the same around education. But we're in an age, and we're in a church, our church, where we have a totally different sphere in terms of the culture that's a part of this church. People from a lot of different dynamics and backgrounds. And so I think we have to respect people from different cultures, different economic backgrounds, and different makeups, and know that they're still a part of the body, and allow that harmony to take form and shape, even though it may be a little bit difficult at times. I think that's the beauty of who God's called us to be, as difficult as that may be.
Great. You pray us out, Darryll?
Sure.
Thanks.
Gracious God, I'm just grateful that we are called to be one body, different members, different functions, but we really are one body. I thank you for just those who have stepped up tonight to show their solidarity, those from a variety of different churches, different cities, all over, who've come together to just to hear Drew and I share our hearts and vision and just to gather around your word of hope for your church and your people. God, we thank you that you are God of our city here in Cincinnati in particular, that you called us to be a city on a hill, all of us in our individual churches coming together, that you call us to be salt and light. And so, God, we don't shirk and pull back from our responsibilities, but God, we purpose to step up and to not be passive, but to reach out and to show love in tangible ways to one another, and to demonstrate to the world what your kingdom looks like. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thanks again, everybody, for coming.
628-0893. If you ever want to text me or give me a shout, 513-628-0893. Anytime.
Thanks again, all. Thanks again, Darryll.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good night.
Good night.